This is Cast Iron. My name is Cody DeVries. I'm in DR 180 and the class is with Mr. Ward. So to start things off, I have a YouTube video. I have a note on there of when to start it and when to end it at. I don't know if you want to watch that on your end, since I have no true way to show it on my end. So what I would recommend doing is watching it on your end, pausing this, and then starting it up after you finish that. For the meantime, though, I'm just going to skip on to the next slide and start presenting. What is cast iron? Cast iron is a type of metal produced with iron alloys and carbon. It's very strong and durable, and it has a stain resistance. It's used with molds to form specific shapes with the molten metal that it uses, and it'll become solid after it cools down. What is cast iron used for? Cast iron is often used for things that need that stain resistance that comes with cast iron. But there's also many different types of cast iron, which I'll cover later, that have certain aspects that may force you to use that over another type. A prime example of the part where the stain resistance is needed is you may have heard of cast iron skillets at one point. That's used for cooking, and the reason that it's made with cast iron is because it'll not, take that stain with it and keep it. Next slide. How is cast iron molded? Cast iron can be molded with sand, which is the most common of the bunch, but it can also be molded with things such as clay. The reason sand is the most common is because the molten metal generally doesn't have a super large effect on the sand itself, so you'll most of the time get consistent results with that. But it's also easy to change the shape if needed. So you can always reform it if needed and reuse that sand. So the first part of the process is they make an imprint in the sand with an object they would like to mold. The main problem with that, though, is you sort of need a concrete design that you've already had made to actually start the molding. From there, you're gonna remove it, creating the imprint, and then there's a sort of powder bag that they put over it, which will stop the sand from sticking to each other. So that way they can have two halves of the actual object made, and then start from that part of the process. And then after the molds are formed, they'll actually make sort of holes in the actual sand. The image up on the slide, they're going to put the hole more towards the corner where the object isn't at, and then from there they can pour it in, and then it'll flow through that hole and then flow into the mold, thus giving it a pathway to take. This will, however, if you do use too much of the cast iron, the hole will also fill up with that metal, and then you're going to need to actually cut the metal sort of tube off, just because it's going to do that. Next slide. So this next slide, it's all it is really is just a 3D model of the thing they're going to mold. I just thought I'd put this up here so you can see what the result would be. So what they're going to do is they're going to take this object, an object that has generally the same exact shape. Everything from the little notches that are on it to the sort of holes that are in it, including that triangular hole. So from there, what they're going to do is they're going to pour the sand on it, but not higher than it. They're not going to put it higher than it. It's all going to stay leveled, and then they're going to scrape it off. So you'll always see metal on top. And then from there, they're going to take that powder bag. I think it showed in the video what the powder bag was. So they're going to take that powder bag, the powder's going to come off, and it's going to prevent the sand from really sticking to it, as well as the actual design from sticking to the sand. Next slide. So just a few types of cast iron to remember. The most important types are going to be gray, ductile, compacted graphite, white, malleable, abrasion resistant, and nodular. Next slide. So here I just have types of cast iron. I think I mentioned it earlier that I would bring some up and then tell you sort of the pros of some of them as well as the purposes that may put it on top of more of a we need to use this rather than this. So to start, we have the pros as white cast iron. So it's a very resistant like type of cast iron to wear and tear. So you shouldn't see as many like scrapes and maybe marks in the metal after it's formed. It also has a high compressive strength, so that could be used for stuff such as, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head, but I guess the situation that it could be used in is something that needs to be pressed together constantly, as well as it also has a solid build and hardness. So this also helps with that high compressive strength. You know it's a reliable cast iron as it's being pressed together, you know it's not going to sort of crack or make any scrapes, as I said before, in it. Chilled gray cast iron. It's very resistant to rubbing and friction, so any moving components that'll be moving alongside each other, it'll help prevent scrapes, scratches, just dullness of metal, I guess, from occurring. It's also a brittle metal, and it has high compressive strength alongside the white cast iron. So again, just things pressed together, also scraping back and forth, very good for that type of stuff. Next up is going to be alloy cast iron. So alloy cast iron, one of the positives of this is it's a very flowy metal when it's in its molten state. So this allows for a really like easy changes to make. It's very easily molded as it kind of is a very loose metal when you're molding it. But then it's also vibration resistant. So anything that's going to be shaking back and forth or scraping against stuff as it shakes, it's going to be very helpful for that. So malleable cast iron is what's next. It's a tougher metal, but it also has a weird ability to bend without fracture. So when you think of metal, most of the times you're gonna think, oh yeah, it's just gonna, be a solid thing. If you do bend it too much, it might bend ever so slightly, but it's gonna start loosening up. The malleable cast iron, though, it's a very tough metal with the ability to bend without fracture. So when you're thinking of it, it's gonna be able to bend immense ways without even having like any sort of really factors that contribute to it cracking or anything as it does that. So it's also cheaper than forging with roughly the same effects. So forging, when you think of it, you may think like hammer, anvil, all that sort of stuff. This, it's as I said before, it's cheaper, so the actual way of doing it is going to be much cheaper, less of a process, less time consuming, but it's also going to have the same effects. So it's going to be a very strong substitute for forging. Next up, I have the purposes of gray cast iron. This is most commonly used for the production of industrial materials, so stuff like if you're having machines that are producing parts for cars or anything like that, it's going to be very common to see in those. It also requires low levels of lubrication, so anything that's going to be moving around constantly, it shouldn't need as much lubrication for that, which is a very helpful part, as it's going to be less like maintained. You're not going to need to put as much maintenance time into that. Finally, we have nodular cast iron. This is most commonly used in the automotive industry, so as I said before, production of cars, but this is going to be more so on the cars itself. It's a strong metal and it has a low production cost than many of the other types, which allows for cheap production of these car parts, whilst also, in a way, giving a more effective, like, you know. The five main points. Cast iron is composed of carbon alloys and iron alloys. This allows for a very strong metal to be produced rather than just having the iron alloys. Cast iron is very stain resistant as well, as I mentioned before, often used for skillets and stuff like that. The stain resistance is very helpful for stuff that, needs that stain resistance, such as the skillet. Cast iron molds require a solid design. As I said, that's sort of maybe a negative in some people's eyes, but also a positive as you can really get a visual of what you're making. So what I said before about that is you really need a solid design to mold. So for some people that could be seen as a positive since they really get to see what they're getting and know the product that will come out. But for others could be a negative if they don't have really a solid design and can't produce one. Cast iron production is a long process. Cast iron, when not done in mass quantities or when not produced as a mass and as a whole, it can be a really long process. I think the video I sent you was upwards of 25, maybe 30 minutes, and that's just for one part in total. Not to mention the fact that it's a dangerous task that can be done, like, without protection, could be a very dangerous task. You're dealing with hot, molten metal that could burn really anything. And you know, that is just in the production of one thing. That is insane to me. It's a very tedious task overall. So then finally we have the different types of cast iron serve different purposes. Some variations are better for different like circumstances than others. As I said before, the like one of the main points would be like something such as gray cast iron. It's most commonly used for like as I said industrial machinery use. So this could be used for the machinery that actually produces stuff. Whereas maybe the nodular cast iron could not be used for that. I said that was used in the automotive industry. It could be a stronger metal, but it has generally different purposes. There's also some of the pros of others. There's the malleable, which is it has the ability to bend, but in some cases you won't need that ability. You'll need more of something such as chilled gray cast iron, which is more resistant to rubbing and friction. So that could really influence the way you choose what cast iron to use. Next slide. So overall conclusive thoughts. Overall, cast iron is a very versatile type of metal that serves many purposes. Cast iron, although a very tedious production task, when not like machine automated, it can have a very strong effect and really positive results. Although it may not seem, cast iron can be found all around us. As I mentioned before, cooking utensils is a big one. Even with forks and knives and stuff, you could easily see that. So, also skillets, as I mentioned. So this is just overall when you start to look around us, there's so many things made of cast iron. There's even hooks of say like if you ever see hooks on a wall or on like a coat rack or something, those oftentimes are made of cast iron. You just have to give it a little thought and you will really notice how important and just how everywhere there's cast iron. And then I'll be right back. I do have a physical item showing cast iron. I will be right back. Give me like 15 seconds. Alright, so I guess another good example, as I mentioned before, sort of like hooks of, say, a coat rack. This is also a cast iron thing. It has a name on it, obviously, but there's the hooks. I don't know if you can see that well. There's a hook here, and then there's tons of small details right here which can be easily pressed into that mold, allowing for a really simple design, or difficult design really, to be made into a really simple design and simple process. That's really all I have for my presentation, besides, the video that you're gonna have to play on your end. Sorry that it had to really occur this way, but thank you for letting me record it and send it to you. And that's all.